The building of the Tower of Babel is a familiar story to most Bible readers. We read in Genesis 11, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves.'" When we read this particular story in Genesis 11, it's just usually seen as a hapless construction project that was never finished and ended with the language of the people being confused and these same people being scattered over the face of the whole earth. End of story. Nothing more to see here. But there is a lot more to see with this ill-fated project. The implications and outcome of the decision to build this tower are crucial to understanding much of what happens in the Old Testament. Let me say that again. You need to hear this. The implications and the outcome of the decision to build this tower at Babel are crucial to understanding much of what happens in the Old Testament. You might say, well, how can you say that? I mean, it seems clear that these people wanted to build a tower to the heavens. They didn't quite get it done, but they wanted to make a name for themselves. God says no and stops the whole project. What's more to the story? Well, there's a great deal more. There are Old Testament scriptures that Bible readers are simply not familiar with that give us a deeper understanding of what's happening in this Genesis 11 account of the building of the tower at Babel. In Deuteronomy 32, which is a very key text, Moses recalls an important moment in Israel's history where Yahweh, after scattering the people at Babel, creates the nations and then disinherits those nations as his people. Yahweh then makes it clear that he is starting over again and Abraham is his choice. Here is what Moses writes in Deuteronomy 32. Moses tells the nations, that is the Israelites rather, to remember the days of old, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance. When he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is his allotted heritage. Here in this text, we discover how the nations of the ancient Near East came to be and how Yahweh disinherits these nations as his people. Moses is telling the people that Yahweh gave these nations their inheritance, which is land, when he fixed their borders. Let me read this again. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people. What is going on here is that God took these people that tried to build this tower toward heavens. They were rejecting Yahweh. They were going to make a name for themselves where they would be great. And now God is scattering these people and now dividing them out, and the borders are being drawn. Nations are being formed. Paul underscores this very, very moment in his speech in Athens when he says, "And he, that is God, made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place." Paul is letting us know what happened so long ago at the Tower of Babel when God created the boundaries and the nations were formed. He had fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. These people were now in different nations. The nations were formed. But note, there's something else that's very important here. Did you catch that? When we read in Deuteronomy 32, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. These newly formed nations were placed under the authority of the members of Yahweh's divine council, the sons of God. A son of God was assigned to each nation. Now you may ask, well, who are the sons of God? Well, they are members of God's heavenly host, his spiritual family. Now hear me, they are not angels. The Hebrew word for angel is malak, and it means messenger. These divine beings were not messengers. God had other divine beings for that purpose. These divine beings were the sons of God, and they were created with higher level responsibilities. These divine beings, they were with God when God was bringing order to a chaotic world, when God was creating. This is made very clear when we read in Job. When God is speaking to Job and says this, "Where were you, Job, when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Did you get that? God is reminding Job, I am the one who created all things. And while he was doing that, he's letting us know that there are these divine beings that are shouting for joy as they watch God do what he is doing. Understand, it is these same sons of God that make up God's divine counsel. You say divine counsel? What is that? Well, let's go to Psalm 82, and this is what we read. In Psalm 82:1, God has taken his place in the divine counsel. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And then down in verse 6, we read, you, that is, sons of God, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. And then again, we read in Job chapter 1, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. These sons of God were members of God's divine council. And when these nations were formed, and in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel incident, a son of God was assigned to watch over each of them, and this was done in judgment toward these people for their actions at Babel. This action is made clear by another passage that we read in Deuteronomy chapter 4, where Yahweh is warning Israel not to worship the host of heaven. Let me read it to you. We find it in Deuteronomy 4, beginning in verse 19. And beware, lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and moon and stars, all the host of heaven, note that, all the host of heaven, you'll be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them. Things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are this day. We are told that Yahweh decreed at the wake of Babel that these newly formed nations that had forsaken him, that had turned away from him, that now they would have other gods to worship. And Israel was not to look to these other gods. Yahweh is essentially saying to these nations, hey, if you don't want to obey me, if you're not interested in me being your God, then I'm going to match you up with other gods. And so, members of Yahweh's divine council, the sons of God, were matched up with all of these different nations when God formed the boundaries and created these nations. This, by the way, is how the gods of other nations came into being. So, when we look at this story in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, we see that these nations, they are formed and then they are disinherited. And Yahweh begins again in the very next chapter when he chooses Abraham. But keep in mind, these nations are not entirely forgotten. For God tells Abraham, when he calls him out, that the nations of the earth, these newly formed nations, if you will, they will be blessed through Abraham and his descendants. We read in Genesis 12, God says to Abraham, I will bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Let me read that again to you. I will bless those who bless you. And in him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, Abraham, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God is doing something very, very big when he calls out Abraham and eventually enters into a covenant of Abraham. And it's through Abraham and his descendants that eventually these nations are going to be drawn back to God. Because even though it was God's intention to judge these nations, it was never his desire to abandon them. This is why the Israelites, by the way, would serve as a conduit, if you will, for the return of these nations to the true God. It's why Israel is called a kingdom of priests. They would be the ones in which the nations of the world would look and see and hopefully return back to Yahweh. Now, of course, we know that's not exactly what happened. In fact, what did happen is that Israel again and again and again finds themselves in a bad place because they become idolaters. They begin worshiping the gods of the other nations, these sons of God. There is so much playing out here. But for now, what we do see is that this fateful decision to build the Tower at Babel, this story that we find in the Old Testament, where we now discover that the conclusion, if you will, or the outcome of this story is that it's Israel now versus these disinherited nations and the gods that they serve. The implications and the outcome of the decision to build the tower are crucial to understanding much of what is happening in the Old Testament. I'll say it again. I've said it already. What happens in Genesis 11 when these nations are formed? Then these nations are disinherited. A son of God is assigned over them. And later we're going to discover that these sons of God desire the worship of the people, and a lot begins to happen. Don't have time to get into all of that. That's really for another video at a later date, dealing with these sons of God, because they do play out. But ultimately, Israel, as a kingdom of priests, the desire was to draw these nations back to God. But Israel fails. This is why the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus to the right hand of the Father becomes key to God's restoration of Eden, where it all began. Because we begin with Eden in Genesis, and if you go to the very end in Revelation, you'll see Eden all over again, a new heaven and a new earth. But to understand the dynamics that are going on, you need to see and understand what is happening in this 11th chapter in Genesis, the Tower of Babel. Please understand, whenever there's a story in your Bible, it's there for a reason. It's not there for you and me to read it, look at it and go, and skip over it and move on. No, it's there because it has significance. It's playing out in God's bigger purposes with all of humanity. And that story in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, oh my friends, it is a very, very important story. Because as I've said already, and I'll say it again, the implications and outcome of the decision to build this tower are critical, are crucial to understanding much of what is happening in the Old Testament, and ultimately why it is that God the Son, Jesus Christ, comes and does what he does. When he dies on the cross, he's buried, rises again, and ascends to the right hand of the Father. Hey, listen, I hope this has been helpful. And if it is, could you just hit that like button? And again, if you've not become a part of this channel, hit the subscription button as well. And let's journey together as we explore all of this wonderful and really interesting stuff that God is revealing to us in his word we call the Bible. Thanks again, and God's very best to you.